We're now moving into our discussion of histology, which is the study of tissues. So previously we talked about cells, and when we covered cytology, remember cells get together and form the next level of organization, which is called tissues. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. So a little bit about tissues in general. It's a group of similar cells that carry out a similar function. And there's 4 types in the human body, and that's it. So there's epithelial, there's connective, there's muscle, and there's nervous. So any other substance in the body can fit into one of those categories. So we're going to spend the bulk of our discussion in this lecture talking about epithelial and connective. And then we're actually going to cover muscle and nervous. We'll just touch on them here, and then we will do multiple chapters on each of those later in the semester. So epithelial tissues, they line body surfaces and cavities. A great example is the skin, so body surface or the lining of your stomach. So 1 or more layers of closely packed cells. Functions are going to be protection, selective permeability, letting certain things through, not letting other things through. Secretions, so think of like maybe sweat glands. And sensations, your ability to feel touch. So characteristics of epithelial tissues. So cellularity just means they have a lot of cells. Polarity means the cells are different on each side. They're not usually completely symmetrical. Like with epithelial tissues, one side is generally attached to something called the basement membrane, and then the other side is free, and you'll see that. So attachment, like I just said, they're attached to a surface commonly known as the basement membrane. They're avascular, meaning epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply. Innervation means there's a nervous tissue that innervates the epithelial tissue. So you have nerves, for example, in the skin, so you can feel things. High regenerative capacity, the epithelial tissues can regenerate really quickly, so their cells can divide and reproduce quickly. So think of your skin again. If you get a scrape or a cut, it usually heals pretty quick. So if we look at this picture, we're seeing epithelial tissue here. In this case, there's only 1 layer of cells, so closely packed cells. So what I want to point out here is one surface is exposed, the other surface is attached. The attached surface is commonly known as the basal surface, and the top that's exposed is called the free surface, also known as the apical surface. And so this is that basement membrane I was referring to. So epithelial tissues are attached to something called the basement membrane. There's 2 layers. There's a basal lamina, which is more superficial, and reticular lamina, which is a little bit deeper. All of this down here would be connective tissue. So remember, epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels, but that's why you see a blood vessel here, because this is connective tissue, which we'll talk about after epithelial. All right, so classifications of epithelial tissue. They're named by the number of layers of cells that are present and also the shape. So as far as the number of layers, if it's only 1 layer of cells, it's classified as simple. If it's more than 1 layer, it's called stratified. If it looks stratified and it's not, it's called pseudo-stratified. And there's one specific example of this, which we'll talk about. As far as the shape only refers to the outer layer. So if there's multiple layers of epithelial tissue, it's named according to the outermost or most superficial layer of cells. So if they're flat, if the cells are shaped like flat or wide cells, they're called squamous. If they look like little cubes, they're called cuboidal. If they look tall, like a column, they're called columnar. And then there's one example where the shape actually can change, and that's called transitional. So you're going to see that in the urinary bladder. When it stretches out, they kind of look flat. When it's not stretched out, it looks more rounded. So flat cells, squamous, 1 layer, simple. So this would be simple squamous. Multiple layers here. So this would be stratified. And if we wanted to look by shape, we look at the outermost layer. These look flat, so I would classify this as stratified squamous. All right, so what we're going to do now is run through all of the epithelial tissues that you need to be able to know about and then also identify. So we're going to start with simple squamous, based on its name, 1 layer, flat cells on the outside. So find this where the little friction abrasion occurs. So generally you find this where you want things to get across. So great example are the air sacs in the lungs, which are called alveoli. They have simple squamous to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to get across. Blood vessels, the inner lining, I should say, of blood vessels, which is called the endothelium, that is simple squamous. And then serous cavities that we've discussed, the serous membranes, that's simple squamous epithelium, and it's called the mesothelium. So this is supposed to be an air sac in the lungs, and you see one layer of flat cells. So we will discuss this in one of the lab videos. We'll see some more microscope slides of all of these. All right, simple cuboidal, one layer, cube-shaped cells. So big place we have these is the kidney. That's probably the number one place we have this. And so it may look a little bit different depending on how you're looking at it. So this is actually a longitudinal section of a kidney tubule. So you're actually seeing two. You got to envision that this is one tube, but since they cut it longitudinally, you're seeing it twice. So one layer, cube-shaped cells, simple cuboidal. Number one place it's found, the kidney. If you saw a cross-section of this, it would look a little bit different. So simple columnar, one layer, column-shaped cells. And find this mainly in the digestive tract. And so if you look at this, one layer, column-shaped cells. Other structures associated with this tissue include microvilli, which increase the surface area. And this is what we would call a brush border that's found in the digestive tract. So microvilli are there forming a brush border. And then these big cells are called goblet cells. Goblet cells secrete mucus, commonly found in simple columnar epithelium. And so notice that I've said non-ciliated. There is another form of simple columnar that has cilia, so it's ciliated. If it has cilia, it's not going to have the microvilli. In this course, we're going to focus mainly on the simple columnar that's non-ciliated that has the microvilli. So keep that in mind. So as far as the ciliated version, you can just know that it exists, but we're not really going to see it any more than just mentioning it. All right, so stratified squamous. So multiple layers with outer layer is flat. So basal layer has stem cells, and what stem cells do is rapidly divide. So what you're going to see, and this is a great example of this, is the skin, and we do have a couple of other places in the body. May or may not have a protein called keratin. That's going to give us two subtypes of this. We can have keratinized stratified squamous or non-keratinized stratified squamous. Keratin is just a protein that helps protect the tissue. So we're going to start with keratinized. So this is what your skin is. So it's keratinized stratified squamous. So what happens here, if we kind of zoom in, I'll zoom in on this one, or I'll focus on this one so you can kind of see what's going on. So all of this from here to here make up the stratified squamous epithelium. And what we have is, you can see how it looks like it's changing halfway. So there's stem cells down here. These stem cells rapidly divide and they migrate this way. And when they get to the top, they get brushed off. So this is why your skin can regenerate so quickly, because there's all these cells that are constantly dividing down here that move up towards the surface. And the other thing, since this is keratinized, at about this point right here, the cells fill with keratin and they die. So the cells that you're actually seeing on the skin are actually going to be dead. And so they fill with keratin, so keratin really dries them out. That's why your skin's dry. And but it also kills the cells. So these are all dead cells going up to the surface. So alive, dead. The non-keratinized version is, I should go back for 1 second. So location-wise, I just said the skin. I should be more specific here. It's specifically the epidermis of the skin. So your skin has two layers, and this will be our next lecture. The Epidermis is all this that we were just talking about. The dermis is down here, which is completely different. It's actually connective tissue. So keep that in mind. When I say skin, I was specifically referring to the epidermis of the skin for stratified squamous epithelium. All right, as far as the non-keratinized version of stratified squamous, it looks similar, but there's no keratin. So the cells still migrate this way towards the surface, but they don't fill with keratin, so the cells are actually still alive when they reach the surface, and they're going to be more moist. So great examples, the inside of your mouth, the oral cavity, like in lining of your cheeks, pharynx, so your throat, esophagus, and vagina. Those are all great examples of stratified squamous epithelium that's non-keratinized. Then we have pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So remember, pseudostratified means falsely stratified, and all cells are going to touch the basement membrane down here, but not all reach the surface. So when you look at this, it gives the appearance of multiple layers, but it's still actually one layer. And so there'll be goblet cells that secrete mucus here. For our purposes, the pseudostratified columnar is always going to have cilia. Great example of this is all through your respiratory tract, starting up in your nasal cavity, then moving down your trachea and down even further. You're going to have the lining of your airways are going to be lined with this tissue that has cilia. So any dust particles or anything that get into the respiratory tract can be moved out by this cilia, and also with the help of the goblet cells secreting mucus to help trap it. All right, transitional, remember, changes shape. So for identification purposes, it's usually shown in the non-stretched out state, so the cells on the surface look rounded. So I always like to think rounded or dome-shaped cells on the surface. So places we have transitional epithelium, the bladder, the urinary bladder, and the ureters, which are also part of your urinary system. So think urinary bladder can stretch out. All right, so those are the major types of epithelial tissues that we need to know, but we need to talk briefly about glandular epithelium. So there are glands associated with epithelial tissue. These are going to be what we call exocrine glands. So endocrine glands are totally different. We'll do a whole chapter on the endocrine system. Those are the ones that secrete hormones. Exocrine glands secrete substances that are not hormones. They don't go into the blood. They usually go to the surface, and they pass through some type of duct like this. So a great example, like a sweat gland, secretes sweat that ends up on the surface of your skin. So exocrine glands have a duct, conducting portion, and an acinus, which is the part that actually secretes the substance.